What's up, everybody? Welcome back to History Valley and Myth Vision. Jacob, what's up, brother?
Oh, good, Derek. How about you?
Good, good. We are discussing Luke Acts today, and it's apparent borrowing to writing his own story from Josephus. And I've prepared a little bit of a presentation, so to speak, here that I'd be interested in taking people through. And I'm sure you have some stuff you would like to add to the picture, and we have discussions about all of the details and things like that. And of course, take your questions, your comments along the way via super chat. We greatly appreciate that. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing really good, Derek. How about you?
Good, good, man. Good. Been hitting the gym again lately, and getting a lot of exercise. Sore right now, real sore. But you got to do what you got to do. So, anyway,
Right.
when do you want to begin? Do we want to start right away?
Sure, I'm ready to go if you are.
Okay. I just hate leaving people hanging, and I wish early birds, showed up, but usually it takes 5-10 minutes before people start trickling in, and they usually miss the first start of the live streams. And so I always get these comments after, why didn't you just start right away? Well, because there's only 40 people here. And I wish people got here earlier. I think it would help the videos get out there more into the algorithm faster if we had people showing up earlier on time for our live streams. But you got to do what you got to do. So let's just begin now. Early bird gets the worm, as we said before. And let's bring this PowerPoint slides up. So we have the title, right? We simply are saying Luke Acts borrowed from Josephus, and why that dates it after 95 CE. Really, let's just say second century. I said
Yeah,
95 because God knows, I mean, if he published it in 93, 94, it's very unlikely Luke had a copy in 1 year. I just grant 6 years and say second century,
sure.
just to be safe. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and switch it here to this opening question, slide 2, and then I'll ask, if you don't mind, Jacob, from here on out, I'll just say next slide,
Yeah,
and we'll go from there. Okay.
sounds good.
So here's the question on the table today, ladies and gentlemen. Did the guy who wrote Luke and Acts have a copy of Josephus, or read Josephus somewhere, came across Josephus somehow? That's the question. And that's how he wrote his material. So next slide. Because if he did, that changes everything. It means Luke Acts was written after 93 CE, when Josephus finished Antiquities. It means a whole pile of conservative arguments about Luke being an early eyewitness of Paul's missionary travels just collapses. And it means the historical reliability of Luke Acts looks a lot more like a literary construction than what the apologists have been selling you. I just had a debate on this exact question, and I'll tell you straight up, in a debate format, with a clock running under pressure, this case is hard to land because the evidence is cumulative. It's not one smoking gun, it's 7 of them. And you need a few minutes on each one to feel the weight. So today, no clock. We're going to take all the time we need. If you have super chats and questions, interrupt me, Jacob. I may not notice it, but if people have super chats, questions, whatever, I'm more than happy to pause, and that takes priority.
Got
So that's important, right? So that we can take the time. There's no clock. Take all the time we need. I'm going to walk through Steve Mason's case with the original quotes from Luke, the original quotes from Josephus, and you can decide for yourself whether this looks like a coincidence or whether Luke had Josephus in some form at some point in front of his eyes. And at the end, I'm going to show you why this also tells us when Luke Acts was written, because Luke gives us 2 more clues. He tells us about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. So even if you didn't buy the later date, which I think more and more people will start to see the strength of what what Steve Mason's arguing, you still have to force this book to be post 70. I think that's a no-brainer. And that's why the consensus is somewhere in the 80s to 90s on average.
exactly.
So the details of the destruction in 70, and there's the details in Luke that Mark didn't have, right? And he hints at Paul's death. That's important, that Luke Acts hints at Paul's death without ever narrating it. Both of those make sense if you're writing in the late 90s or early 100s. They don't make sense if you're writing in the 60s, like the apologists want. So next slide, please. Before we look at any specific parallels, you have to understand the principle Mason builds his whole case on. Here's the rule: events do not describe themselves, they don't supply the words. Two independent writers describing the same event will use different vocabulary, different framings, different details. We can prove this works because Josephus himself, this is one of the most important points I think Steve Mason articulates. Josephus himself describes the same events very differently in war and in antiquities. Same author, same events, different words. Next slide. So here's the test. If text A and text B share a feature, you have three options typically. 1, A used B. 2, B used A, or 3, both used a common source C. Now here's the part that nukes the common source defense. If A has feature X and X fits A's distinctive style, vocabulary, themes, narrative interest, but X shows up in B as a one-off mention with no follow-up and no thematic role, then A wrote it first and B borrowed it. The feature is at home in A. It's a tourist in B, meaning Luke Acts. Next slide, please. Mason puts it this way. If characteristic features of text A appear in text B where they are not characteristic, then B borrowed A directly or indirectly in some way. That's the whole game. Now let's apply it to Luke and Josephus. Next slide. Open Luke chapter 2, verse 1. It's a Christmas story, everybody. Everybody should know this. Next slide. Luke 2, 1 through 2. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Three things to notice here. First, Augustus orders a registration of the whole world. Second, Quirinius is named as governor of Syria. And third, the Greek word for registration is apography. Hold that word in your mind, apography. Next slide. Now, open Josephus, Antiquities, Book 18. In the very first chapter, what do we find? Quirinius, a Roman senator who had passed through the various magistries to the consulship, and a man who was extremely distinguished in other respects, arrived in Syria, having been sent by Caesar to be assessor of the nation and to make a valuation of their property. That's Antiquities 18:1. Same governor, same census, same word in Greek, apography. Luke uses that word 4 times in his account. Josephus uses it as the technical term throughout Antiquities 18. Now here's where it gets interesting. Mason makes the point that the events of 6 CE could be told 1,000 different ways. Josephus himself tells them in 2 different ways. In War, Book 2, Josephus barely mentions any of this. He says Coponius came as procurator. Judas the Galilean got upset. End of story. He doesn't even mention Quirinius. It's only in Antiquities, written 15 years later, that Josephus develops the whole package. Quirinius as governor, the province-wide property registration, Judas the Galilean leading the revolt, the high priest Joazar trying to calm the people down. All of that is unique to Antiquities. So Josephus doesn't even agree with Josephus on what he's going to write when he's detailing an event. Next slide. And this should be the worldwide census problem. Are we in alignment?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And what does Luke do? He grabs the Antiquities version, Quirinius, census, even the same Greek word. But Luke gets one thing wildly wrong. He claims this was a worldwide census ordered by Augustus, requiring people to travel to their ancestral homeland. Pause on that. We need what? Imagine telling 50 million people across the Roman Empire that they have to pack up their families and travel to whatever town their ancestor lived in 1,000 years ago. The Roman economy would collapse in a week. It never happened. It couldn't have happened. There's no record of it in any other source. Augustus didn't do this. But what did happen Quirinius did a property registration in Syria, including Judea in 6 CE. That's what Josephus describes in detail, great detail. Luke knew that detail. He just didn't understand it. He had to get Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem somehow. So he turned a regional Syrian property assessment into a worldwide travel mandate. This is what Mason calls vestigial use. The Quirinius reference fits Josephus's detailed narrative perfectly. In Luke, it's a dangling thread that creates a historical absurdity. That tells you which way the borrowing went. Next slide. This one, for me, in my opinion, is the most damning piece of evidence. Acts chapter 5. Gamaliel is making a speech to the Sanhedrin, telling them to leave the apostles alone. Listen to what he has to say. Next slide. Acts 5, 36 to 37. For before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. Notice Theudas first, then Judas the Galilean after him. Next slide. Now here's the problem. Gamaliel is supposedly making this speech in the early 30s of the Common Era, right after the resurrection, some year or two after the resurrection. The historical Judas the Galilean led his revolt in 6 CE. Fine, there's no problem with that. But the historical Theudas, Josephus tells us exactly when Theudas, spelled identical to what Luke spells. I know that me and Jacob have something to discuss about this in a little bit, but this is an important detail. The same identical name appears in the same passage in Antiquities 20. And you're going to notice this guy was active after Gamaliel talks. What? Was Gamaliel seeing a decade into the future? Here's what it says. Now it came to pass, while Cuspius Fadus was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician whose name was Theudas persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them he was a prophet, and that he would, by his own command, divide the river and afford them an easy passage over it. Antiquities 20:97. Cuspius Fadus was procurator from 44 to 46 CE. So Theudas got himself killed somewhere around 45 or 46 CE, which means Gamaliel in the early 30s CE is referring to a man who hasn't risen up yet. He's predicting the future, which would be impressive if Luke wasn't clearly using this as a casual historical example. So Luke gets the chronology backwards. Theudas didn't come before Judas. Theudas came 40 years after Judas. How did this happen? Next slide. Open Josephus, Antiquities Book 20. Read paragraph 97 about Theudas. Then read paragraph 102. Just 5 sentences later, watch what happens. Quoting it. Then came Tiberius Alexander as successor to Fadus. And besides this, the sons of Judas of Galilee were now slain. I mean of that Judas who caused the people to revolt when Quirinius came to take an account of the estates of the Jews. Antiquities 2102. Right after Theudas, Josephus mentions Judas the Galilean. Theudas first, then Judas. Exactly the order Luke puts them. And in fact, I think this is an important moment to just show everybody. I made this image. I've shown this before. On the left bottom, Theudas gets mentioned. 5 sentences later, Judas the Galilean gets mentioned. You can see the same wrong order in Acts. Why? Because Josephus is doing a flashback. He's flashing back to the time about a guy named Judas who led a revolt during Quirinius's taxation. So he's not a fan of that. But his sons get executed. So he has a reason to bring the guy's name back up. Luke must have half-assed read Josephus and got the order wrong, or was careless in his assessment on what happened historically here. Because his whole intention of having Gamaliel say the speech of, well, there was a man named Judas and there was a man named Theudas, had nothing to really do with the historical, like, you must trust this guy is telling you what really happened. His point is theological, and it's saying many have come and gone. Many have said they're prophets. Many have said they have powers, and they got killed. Brethren, if you fight against this movement and it is of God, you will become theomakoi, God fighters. Don't do it. Let God take care of them. Don't catch yourself fighting against God. It's a theology thing. It's not a historical, precise historical statement. So now think about what this means. The actual chronological order is Judas in 6 CE, Theudas in 45 CE, but the order they appear in next to each other in Antiquities 20, Theudas first, Judas mentioned right after. That is the order Luke gives, as I was pointing out. Next slide. Here's the clincher Mason brings up. The name Theudas is rare. It does not appear in any text before Josephus and Acts. It's a Greek shortened form of Theodorus that doesn't become fashionable until the 2nd century of the Common Era. So Luke didn't get his name from oral tradition. He didn't pull it from common memory. He got it from the only source that had it, Josephus. In a debate, I had to rush through this one. I want you to feel the weight here. Same 2 names, same wrong order, same source for one of the names. Anybody who tells you Luke didn't read Josephus needs to explain this without the word coincidence. They can't. Next slide. Luke 3, verse 1, the famous synchronization. Luke wants to date when John the Baptist starts preaching, so he name drops every Roman and Judean official he can think of. I really wish I'd have thought this one up when I was critiquing Wes Huff, because this is an important point that Wes Huff acted like, oh, it's impeccable historical, evidence of getting everything correct. No. Next slide. On screen, you should see Luke 3:1. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate began being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene. Most of these names they make sense. Tiberius for the date, Pilate, Herod Antipas, Philip, the high priests. These are characters that show up in the story. But Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, is a small region. This area, Abilene, is a small region near Damascus, 60 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. Lysanias never appears again in Luke or Acts. Abilene never appears again. The reference does not work in the story. It's this character. I'm going to have to explain this. So next slide. So worse than that, the only Lysanias of Abilene we know about, the one who was actually tetrarch of that region, was executed by Mark Antony in 33 BCE. That is 60 years before John the Baptist starts preaching. Luke is dating John's ministry by referencing a guy who was dead before Augustus became emperor. Apologists have spent hundreds of years trying to prove there was a second Lysanias around 30 CE. There's basically no evidence for one. Some inscriptions are debated. None of them clearly establishes a contemporary Lysanias. So why does Luke mention this guy? Next slide. Open Josephus. Watch what he does. Josephus describes the original Lysanias executed in 33 BCE. Fine. But then Josephus keeps calling that whole region the Tetrarchy of Lysanias for the next century after Lysanias is dead. Caligula gives the Tetrarchy of Lysanias to Agrippa I in the 30 CE. Claudius confirms Abila of Lysanias to Agrippa. Claudius gives Abila, formerly the Tetrarchy of Lysanias, to Agrippa II. And here we're reading from Josephus. Caesar, Claudius, also bestowed on Agrippa his whole paternal kingdom immediately and added it to Abila of Lysanias, Antiquities 19:275. Josephus uses Lysanias as a regional label, the way we'd say the Carolinas, long after King Charles is dead. Lysanias was the first guy to put that little area on the map, and the name stuck. Mason's argument is that Luke read Josephus and misunderstood him. Luke saw the phrase Tetrarchy of Lysanias attached to events in the 30s and assumed there must have been a guy named Lysanias actually tetrarching at that time. There wasn't. The territory was a place name. The man had been dead for 60 years. And here's the kicker, all right? Why would any source other than Josephus mention this? Lysanias is irrelevant to John the Baptist. He's irrelevant to Jesus. He's irrelevant to Acts. The only reason for him to appear in Luke 3 is that the author was reading Josephus, saw the name attached to that region, and dropped it in to sound informed. It's name dropping. Luke does it constantly, and here he name drops the wrong guy because he didn't understand what he was reading. Next slide. Acts 21. Paul has been arrested in the temple. Roman soldiers grab him, and as they're hauling him up the steps to the Antonia fortress, the tribune asks him a really weird question. Next slide. Acts 21:38 says, "Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" The Greek word translated assassin is Sicarii, plural. Sicarius, singular. The 4,000 men of the Sicarii led by the Egyptian into the desert. Next slide. This sequence is a mess if you know anything about first century Judea. 3 things in it: the Egyptian, the Sicarii, the desert. In Josephus, all 3 exist, but they're 3 completely different things. Sicarii, Latin word for sica, a curved concealed dagger. Sicarii are urban assassins. They blend into festival crowds in Jerusalem. Get next to a target, draw the dagger, sneak up, stab, walk away into the chaos. The first famous victim was the high priest Jonathan, killed under Roman governor Felix in the late 50s of the Common Era. Now, mind you, Josephus mentions they are in the 50s, that this idea of these assassins, the Sicarii, never appear in history till the 50s. So what's Luke talking about when he mentions Sicarii in the 30s? What's going on? This makes no sense chronologically, historically. Anyway, we'll keep going. The Sicarii are not freedom fighters. They're stealth murderers in cities. They do not march in the desert. They do not have armies of 4,000. That's not what they are. Next slide. Now the Egyptian, different guy, different category. Josephus describes him in War Book 2. Quote, "The Egyptian false prophet led after him 30,000 men that were deluded by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the mount which was called the Mount of Olives, and was ready to break into Jerusalem by force." That's in War 2, 261. So the Egyptian is a charismatic prophet who promises miracles. He gathers followers in the wilderness, marches them to the Mount of Olives, plans to enter Jerusalem and overthrow the Roman garrison. Josephus says he had 30,000 followers. Luke says 4,000. They got into the desert and out of the desert, but they're a prophetic movement, not an assassination cell. And the desert wanderings, 3rd category. Josephus mentions a series of false prophets who led people into the wilderness, promising signs and miracles. These are messianic figures. They're not Sicarii. They're not assassins. They're prophets. So in Josephus, you've got 3 distinct phenomena: stealth assassins in the city, the Egyptian as one of the desert prophets, and generic desert miracle workers, 3 different things. In Acts, Luke fuses all 3 into one sentence: the Egyptian who led the Sicarii into the desert. That's logically impossible. It's like saying the bank robber who led the football team into the swimming pool. The categories don't combine. So how did this happen? Open Josephus War Book 2. Paragraph 254 starts with the Sicarii, the urban assassins. Paragraph 258 immediately after talks about the false prophets who led people into the wilderness. Paragraph 261, 3 sentences later, introduces the Egyptian, specifically as one of those false prophets. Now do the same thing in Antiquities 20. Paragraphs 162 to 165, Sicarii. Paragraphs 167 to 168, false prophets in the desert. Paragraph 169, the Egyptian. All three things appear back to back in both Josephus's histories. Sicarii, desert prophets, the Egyptian. 3 paragraphs in a row, twice. Luke read those paragraphs. He saw 3 exotic-sounding things in close proximity. He didn't understand they were 3 different things. He fused them into one dramatic line for the tribune to throw at Paul. The Egyptian who led 4,000 Sicarii into the desert. It sounds informed. It sounds like the author knows insider details about Judean rebel groups. The audience can't fact-check him because the audience has never heard of any of this. Next slide. So here's another smoking gun within the smoking gun. The word Sicarii is Latin. It's a transliteration from Latin into Greek. No Greek author transliterates this word except Josephus. Josephus uses it 19 times because he's writing in Rome for a Roman audience that knows what a Sicarius is. He calls these guys Sicarii because his Roman readers would understand the scare word. There's no other Greek author who picks up this word. Nobody, until Luke uses it in Acts 21. One time, in a context that doesn't even make sense. Where did Luke get a Latin loanword that exists nowhere in Greek literature outside Josephus? Take a wild guess. Next slide. This one is more subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. And in fact, when I spoke to Steve Mason on the phone just recently, he believes this is the most powerful piece of evidence, but you have to know a lot more about the language in order to recognize the strength of it. He thinks is the best one. Okay, let me give it to you. Josephus has a literary signature. He likes the rule of 3, and he constructs Judean society around 3 philosophical schools: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. He calls these 3 schools hieresis, philosophical sects. He compares them to Greek philosophical schools. Here's the thing. Nobody else does this. Look at every other ancient source on Pharisees and Sadducees, the other Gospels, Paul's letters, the rabbis. Pharisees and Sadducees are described as opposed parties. There's no third group. Look at every other ancient source on Essenes. Philo describes them. Pliny the Elder describes them. They're a separate community. There's no triad. The 3 schools framework is Josephus's invention. It's how he organized Judean philosophy for his Greek and Roman readers, who are used to thinking about Stoics, Epicureans, and a third school. So when Acts uses this same framework that's Josephus's framework, specifically, Acts uses the word hieresis as a default category for Pharisees, Sadducees, and Christians. That's Josephine vocabulary. Next slide. But here's where it gets really good. Listen to Acts 26, verse 5. Paul is speaking to King Agrippa II. Here's what it says. They have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that according to the strictest party of our religion, I have lived as a Pharisee. The strictest party. In Greek, and I'm going to butcher this here, maybe you can help me with the first word here, Jacob. I believe it's akrabistatin, something like that.
I think akrabistatin is more likely the right way of pronouncing it.
Yeah, akrabistatin, Harrison. I hope I'm properly doing the best I can there with someone who's not proficient in Greek. The most precise sect. That's a superlative, most precise. Implies at least 3 things being compared. Next slide. Now open Josephus. The Pharisees, who are considered the most accurate interpreters of the laws and hold the position of the leading sect, War 2, 162. And then the Pharisees were considered the most accurate interpreters of the law, Life 191. Josephus uses this phrase, the most precise interpreters of the laws, 4 times across his works, and he applies it specifically to the Pharisees within his 3-school framework. The most precise of the 3, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. Luke picks up this exact framework, 3 schools. Pharisees as the most precise, the superlative, the hieresis vocabulary. Next slide. Then Acts 26:5 hits you with one more Josephine fingerprint. Paul says, I lived as a Pharisee in our religion. The Greek word for religion here is threskia. Mason points out that threskia is overwhelmingly a Josephus word. All across all the Greek literature before Josephus, it appears literally only 23 times. Josephus alone uses it 91 times. It's his preferred term for Judean piety. And here it is in Acts 26. So in one verse, you have the three-school framework, the most precise label for the Pharisees, the hieresis terminology, and the threskia vocabulary, 4 Josephine fingerprints in 15 Greek words. That's not coincidence, ladies and gentlemen. That's Luke writing what Josephus has in mind. And I think it's important to point out again, if you go look at the Gospels, the treatment of the Pharisees with the Sadducees, etc., is unique and different to that of Luke Acts. What Luke Acts does is mimic what we have in Josephus. Next slide. So we're going to have some objections, right? Let me still man the other side because the apologists have responses, and I want you to know what they are and why they fell. Next slide. Response 1. Maybe Josephus borrowed from Luke. Reverse the dependence. This one is dead on arrival. All right. Josephus has full narratives with elaborate detail. The Quirinius census takes up a whole opening chapter of Antiquities 18 with names, dates, motivations, the high priest Joazar, the consequences. The Sicarii get 19 mentions across his works with detailed descriptions of their methods, their weapons, their victims. Theudas gets a paragraph with his prophecy, his followers, his beheading. The 3 schools framework runs through war, antiquities, life, and against Appian. In Luke Acts, all this material appears as one-liners. Quirinius, 1 verse. Lysanias, half a verse. Sicarii, 1 sentence. The most precise Pharisee, two verses. If Josephus borrowed from Luke, you would have to believe that Josephus took a half sentence about Lysanias from Luke 3 and built 50 mentions across his books. You have to believe Josephus took one weird tribune question and built 19 reference Sicarii narrative. That's not how literary borrowing works. The richer, more developed source is the source. Josephus. Next slide. Response 2. Maybe they both used a common source, the lost source defense. This was standard scholarly view 100 years ago. Why? Because back then, nobody cared about Josephus's literary craft. They thought he just collected facts that floated in the air, ready for any author to pick up. So if Luke and Josephus had similar material, they both grabbed from the same data pool. That defense doesn't survive contact with actual data. The features that show up in Luke aren't neutral facts. They're Josephine literary constructions. The 3 schools framework is his structure. Calling Theudas a generic rebel is his framing. Using Latin Sicarii is his Roman audience choice. Using threskia for piety is his vocabulary. If Luke and Josephus used a common source, that common source would have to look exactly like Josephus. It would need to have his literary signatures, his vocabulary choices, his 3-school structure, at which point you've just described Josephus. That's what me and Steve Mason have talked about endlessly. Why are we inventing an extra source we have no evidence for? Occam's razor, ladies and gentlemen. And by the way, that source would look identical to the one we already have. Postulating a lost source when it would look exactly like Josephus anyway? So again, I would just say Occam's razor. If you have a known source that explains the evidence, don't invent unknown sources that look identical. Next slide.
Before we get to the next slide, would you have a super chat?
Perfect.
Before we get to that, Justina, thank you for becoming a member. Bakken, thank you for gifting 5 History Vibe memberships and also 5 Myth Vision memberships.
Rock on.
Bakken, thank you for your super chat. Notice the conflict of interpreter of the law, the doers, say, of the law, and the false scribes and priests they called Essenes innovators for refusing to do propitiation animal sacrifices.
Yeah,
propitiation, excuse me.
This is an important observation that both not only Bakken has been noticing for a while now, and I love what he's doing. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you do so. But scholars like James Tabor talk often about this whole animal sacrifice, the propitiation blood stuff, and how this is related to the lying pen of the scribes. A lot of these priestly scribes who are trying to, I guess you'd say, maybe, I don't want to like act like we can compartmentalize their minds. They may actually believe in blood magic and have some kind of strange blood idea in their worship and their religion. But many of them said, hey, no, we're not into, blood is not necessary to propitiate for sin. Doers of the works of the law, like doing the right thing. And one of those things is the basic things you do here in the New Testament, which is the idea of helping the widow, helping the poor, being kind, and that's good religion, right? In that alone is an atonement by many people, that just by being and doing good, doing the works that are righteous, that alone is an atoning thing, and not necessarily the animal propitiation or blood sacrifice stuff. And I think James Tabor is of the opinion that Jesus's whole temple scene, I want to call it, is due to animals being slaughtered inside the Jerusalem temple. And he sees it as, you're abusing your power. You're obviously doing it for greed and money, but you don't need this. I would want to mention one thing too, that Bakken mentioned in what I was presenting there. Notice the three schools. Notice what Luke Acts is making the third school, the Christians. Notice what Josephus makes the third school, Essenes. I mean, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees in both, but in Luke Acts, he doesn't name the Essenes. He names the Christians. In Josephus, he names the Essenes, but he doesn't name the Christians. And I'm just saying, is Luke hijacking that and saying that they're the same in his observation? I don't know. I just figured I'd throw that out there because I know Bakken is very much in looking for the Essene stuff. Thank you for that super chat. All right. You want me to continue?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Mason's verdict on both responses in one line. You can't get there from here. Josephus has the material at home in his work. Luke has it as a tourist. Next slide. And this should be the slide why this dates Luke Acts after 95. Are we in the same boat?
Yes.
Okay. So, we've established Luke read Josephus. Antiquities was finished in 93 CE. So at the very earliest, Luke Acts was written after 93 CE, probably mid-90s or later, for the book to circulate and get into Luke's hands, get read, get used, whatever. You know, I'm granting the 6 years and saying early 2nd century. That's 6 years after he publishes his work in Rome, and it starts to spread, and maybe it's hitting other libraries and people are copying it, or maybe this guy visited the area and read it and or heard it somewhere. So, but that's not the only evidence, okay? Luke gives us two more clues that point to this. I would say at least supports the late date. It doesn't date it past 93. The example we're going to start with is the destruction of Jerusalem. Next slide. Compare two passages, Mark 13, then Luke 21. Both are talking about the destruction of the temple. I think most scholars, that's like overwhelming consensus. Here's Mark 13:14. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Vague, apocalyptic, abomination of desolation, that Daniel type language. And there's not really any specifics, even though I think it's specific enough that you and I would probably agree. This is obviously talking about at least the Roman-Jewish War. Some even go further, and I'm waiting for their work to be published and just see how it works, Bar Kokhba. But either way, you're talking about a legit, serious situation here. All right.
I think it's Bar Kokhba too, actually.
Okay. I don't know. Huh?
With Luke.
Gotcha. So either way you slice it, it's major warfare language. Okay. Now here's Luke. Same scene. Jesus on the Mount of Olives. It's the identical narration. Like it starts with he's taking and showing them the buildings in Jerusalem and to the fig tree being cursed. Okay, it's the identical episode, but Luke does something different from Mark. And he says in Luke 21:20-24, watch what happens with the language. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Notice what Luke added. Jerusalem surrounded by armies, people falling by the sword, captives led among the nations, Jerusalem trampled by Gentiles. That is exactly what happened in 70 CE. One can argue that's exactly what happened in Bar Kokhba. So Titus surrounded Jerusalem with the Roman legions. I'm going to stick with the 70 CE part here, just for the sake of this, the consensus. Titus surrounded Jerusalem with the Roman legions, built a circumvallation wall, slaughtered the population, took thousands as captives, paraded them in his triumph in Rome, burned the temple, trampled the city. Mark, written probably right around 70 CE or a little after, according to the consensus, has the apocalyptic vision, but not the historical specifics. Luke, writing later, knows what actually happened and updates the prediction to match the event. Next slide. Luke 19. Let's look at it. Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. In verse 43 to 44, it says, "For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." A barricade around the city, hemming in on every side, tearing the city to the ground, not one stone left upon another. This is not generic apocalyptic language. That is the Roman siege of Jerusalem. Josephus describes the very same circumvallation wall in War Book 5. So Luke knows the details of the Roman siege in 70 CE. He's not predicting the future. He's describing the past and putting the description in Jesus' mouth as prophecy. This is what scholars call Vaticanum ex eventu, prophecy after the event. It's a normal literary technique in ancient apocalyptic writing, and it tells you Luke wrote after 70 CE. Combined with Josephus' parallels, it pushes the date past 90 CE, 93. All right, clue 2, next slide. Here's the part conservatives don't like to talk about. Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome, preaching the gospel, the end. No execution, no martyrdom. Apologists love this. They say Acts must have been written before Paul died in 62 CE, because Luke would obviously have included the death if he knew about it. Therefore, Acts is early. Therefore, Luke is early. Therefore, reliable. Therefore, eyewitness. Sounds great until you actually read Acts. Acts chapter 20, Paul is saying goodbye to the Ephesian elders at Miletus. Listen to this carefully. Acts 20, verse 25 says, "And now behold, I know that none of you among whom I have gone about proclaiming the kingdom will see my face again." Acts 20, verse 38, "Being sorrowful most of all because of the world he had spoken, that they would not see his face again." Paul is telling them he is going to die. They know it. They're weeping over it. Acts 21, the prophet Agabus shows up. And it says this in verse 11, "Taking Paul's belt, he bound his own feet and hands and said, 'Thus says the Holy Spirit, this is how the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him to the hands of the Gentiles.'" Paul is bound and handed over to Gentiles, just like Jesus. And then verse 13, "Then Paul answered, 'What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be imprisoned, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus.'" Ready to die? The whole second half of Acts is shadowed by Paul's coming death. The author writes scene after scene where Paul says goodbye, predicts his end, accepts his fate. So when the book ends with Paul in Rome and no execution scene, that's not because the author didn't know. The author knew. The author keeps telling you in coded language that Paul is going to die. Next slide. So why doesn't he narrate the death?
Before we get to that,
sure.
Super chat.
Let's hit it.
Steve M., thank you for your super chat. Conspiracy theory. Josephus did a Stephen King and wrote Luke Acts under a pseudonym. Keep up the great work, guys.
Steve, thanks for the super chat. Love it. Love it. Oh, goodness. That's funny. I don't know why my mind's wanting to think of the funny People's Front of Judea, the Judeans People Front from from Life of Brian. I don't know why my brain went there. So why doesn't he narrate the death, right? Why doesn't Luke Acts just write it and say, all right, this is what happened? 3 reasons. First, the audience already knew. Paul's martyrdom was famous. By the time Luke is writing in the 90s or early 100s, Paul has been dead for 30 years. You don't have to spell out something everybody knows. Second, the literary purpose of Acts is to show the gospel reaching Rome. Acts 1:8, the ends of the earth. Acts ends with Paul preaching unhindered. It literally, the last word is that like the gospel has gone forth unhindered in Rome. That's a powerful proclamation. That's the climax. The point is the gospel has arrived. If you tack on an execution scene, you undercut the triumphant ending. Third, this matches the author's pattern. Luke deliberately chose to keep Jesus' biography separate from the church's later history. Mason makes this point really well. Luke saw the other gospel writers cramming later church concerns into Jesus' lifetime. And Luke decided, no, I'll separate them. Volume 1 for Jesus, Volume 2 for the church. He's careful about narrative boundaries. So ending Acts with Paul reaching Rome and not narrating his death is consistent with that careful structuring. Notice what this argument does to the apologetic position. The apologists want Acts written before Paul's death because Acts doesn't narrate Paul's death. Argument from silence. But Acts does foreshadow Paul's death repeatedly in detail with explicit speeches. The author knows what's coming. He doesn't just show it. That's a literary choice, not evidence of an early date. Mason is on the same page here, and so is Daniel B. Glover, who also wrote a peer-reviewed article debunking the earlier date. And so the broader consensus as well that places Luke Acts around 95 to 110. So with some scholars going as late as the 120s, 130s, even later some are, right? Based on possible influences from Marcion's gospel. Either way, you're nowhere near 62 CE. So whatever position you take, wherever you want to land on all that stuff, the liberty is yours. I'm simply going with what I think is concrete here. There's much more I can get into about Luke's motif and his goal. I mean, I can get into the fact that he doesn't want to narrate the death of Paul because he's already narrated the death of Jesus. And if you chronicle the parallels that go on between the life of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke and the life of the early church and their persecutions, you'll find a mirror that reflects what's going on in both stories. The significant point theologically for Luke is the resurrection of Jesus, not the atonement. That's Pauline. It's the resurrection. And if you have Paul die, and he does what the Acts of Paul did, decapitated him, milk came from his neck and all, then you have to narrate his resurrection as the Acts of Paul did. Guess what? You made a resurrection for Paul. Then there's nothing special for Jesus. Jesus is the only one who resurrects from the dead. So if you narrate the death of Paul and want to end it on a positive note, you need to resurrect him. It doesn't work. The other problem is, and we can get into so many weeds, people go, well, if you have to narrate the death of Paul, you have to narrate the trial of Nero. That doesn't help Rome, number one. In every case, Rome is the one getting Christians out of the trouble that they are supposedly in to finding out they are innocent. Rome is innocent. Christians are innocent. Who's not innocent? The Jewish, I guess you say the educated Jewish elites, the Jewish priests, the Pharisees, etc. They are often seen as guilty in these narratives. So you would see the Jews constantly trying to rile up the crowds, constantly trying to get Christians imprisoned and killed. And it's the Romans that are innocent. What does it look like if you have your end of your story? Oh, and by the way, the chief Roman, the emperor himself, killed Paul. That doesn't help your cause. On top of that, you do have narrations where Jews are martyring people. We can get into the weeds about why there's no narration of the death of James, but the latter half of Acts is all about Paul's journey. So he's not escaping and taking a different view and pulling off from Paul to go show you what's going on with Peter over here. He doesn't need to narrate Peter because the latter half of Acts is about Paul. There's so many details we can get into about why it doesn't work for the early date and why they would not have narrated this material that makes perfect sense within the narration of Luke Acts. All right. So next slide, we should be at, let me pull this all together for you. Are we there?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me pull it together, right? Next slide. We have the slide after that one. So you're let me see where you're at. The cases. Yep, keep it there. There we go. So the case in one slide. We have 7 specific cases where Luke-Acts mentions something that fits Josephus's narrative, his literary fingerprint, and shows up nowhere else in surviving ancient literature. The Quirinius census with the right Greek word and wrong scope. Theudas and Judas in the wrong order, in the same wrong order. Powerful point. The same wrong order they appear in Antiquities 20. Lysanias of Abilene as a contemporary tetrarch when he'd been dead for 60 years. Sicarii fused with the Egyptian, fused with the desert, with the desert in a sentence that makes no sense. The 3 schools framework with Pharisees as the most precise, using Josephus' own vocabulary, including threskia. And add to that the literary updating of Mark's apocalyptic language to match the actual events of 70 CE siege of Jerusalem. Add to that the foreshadowing of Paul's death without narrating it. Paul literally explicitly says, you're not going to see my face anymore. And I think that's important, which only makes sense if you're writing decades after the fact for an audience that already knows about the outcome. And the analogy I made in my debate before I continue is if we were reading a story about Abraham Lincoln and he's outside the Ford Theater before they actually are doing the presentation, and he pulls in his friends and he says, listen, guys, if we're reading a story about Abraham Lincoln today, and he said to his friends, this is the last time you're ever going to see my face, we would all know. I don't think any modern reader would ever go, nope, that's not him hinting at he's going to get shot and assassinated in Ford's theater. Like, if someone wrote a story hinting at you're never going to see me again right outside of the event he's about to enter into, and mind you, Paul goes to Jerusalem 5 times in the book of Acts. Why is he now all of a sudden making the statement that you're never going to see me again as the last visit? It's obvious. He knows, just like Abraham Lincoln saying something like that, you would know if you were reading that story. All of this points in the same direction. Luke-Acts was written after 93 CE. The author had Josephus available. He used it as a research source to pad his historical credibility. He sometimes got it wrong because he was working from memory or skimming. He blended things he shouldn't have blended. He put events in the wrong order. He inflated regional events into worldwide ones, Quirinius. But the literary fingerprints are unmistakable. In a debate, you have 10 minutes to land this case and somebody objecting in real time. It's hard to land. My first actual moderated debate ever in history, I chose this topic, which is a nightmare. It's an uphill battle to try and, convince, especially when your audience doesn't know this material. So today with the time, I had the time to lay this out. I think the case is overwhelming, and I hope that you have been convinced as well. Next slide. Mason puts it best, and I'll close with this. These are not free-floating data in some kind of neutral language and ready for anyone's use. They all bear the telltale marks of Josephus's literary construction. It seems, therefore, that Luke borrowed them, half-remembered or carelessly reworked from the most famous Judean author of his day to help shore up his credibility as a writer, end quote. Next slide. That's the case. Luke read Josephus. He wrote after 95, at least, I'd say early 2nd century. The early dating argument from a missing Paul death scene falls apart the second you actually read Acts 20. And the historical reliability of Luke-Acts looks a lot more like a literary project than what the apologists have been telling you, that this is like bona fide historical reportage, someone running around with a stenographer detailing what actually happened. We can get into the wee passages and explain why that doesn't hold up either in the actual text to see where did he go? Where did this third person plural disappear to? We can get into all that stuff if you want to, Jacob. But anyway, next slide. I just want to say thank you to everybody. Drop your thoughts in the chat, super chat your questions, comments, critiques, whatever, challenges. It's all good. Let's get into it. And thank you for your patience, Jacob, and doing this for me. I really appreciate it, man.
Oh, no problem, man. Of course.
Someone said the debate was taken down?
No, I wrote in there that it wasn't taken down.
Yeah, no, it's on the channel. It's a live stream though, so it was all live. You know what I mean? And
right.
Anyway, yeah, what would you like to add, man? Sorry for the long presentation.
Oh no, it's fine. Yeah, I pretty much agree with what Steve Mason has said. I think what he said about Theudas and Judas of Galilean actually makes sense. and I don't dispute it. I think in some sense I've been misunderstood. Maybe it could be partially my fault with the way I phrased it. But I think let me show this. I'm gonna pull this. I'm gonna pull up these slides on the screen here.
Gotcha.
Give me a second. I want to show that I want to show another character that Josephus talks about that I think played a role in why Acts made that mistake with Theudas. Because I'm not disputing necessarily that Theudas is the same guy and that Acts was wrong, but I think there might be another reason on top of the one you've brought up earlier.
Okay.
So this is in Antiquities 1842. Looks like StreamYard's got some of that text kind of bleeding off the screen in the bottom there. But anyway,
it's all good.
We see most of it, so it should be fine. Theudion. Now, granted, I know that the spelling is not exactly the same. I'm not even really saying that this is the same guy in Acts necessarily. Now, you mentioned earlier that
his phone.
Yeah, sometimes if you say a word that sounds like Siri, thinks you're talking to it.
Exactly.
I turned it off, so that shouldn't happen again for the duration of the stream. But anyway, Theudion had a plot in motion to assassinate Herod the Great, and I think this happened around 4 BC. Now, you mentioned earlier that Josephus was having a flashback about Theudas, and he mentions Theudas first. Then he brings up Judas the Galilean, even though it's really the other way around chronologically.
He flashes back to Judas, yeah.
Right. Acts misinterprets Josephus because Josephus wrote in that way. And I think that a second reason why Luke misinterpreted Josephus is I think he probably got confused and thought this guy might have been the guy that Josephus was flashbacking to without fully realizing, no, that's not him. And Theudas actually did die after Judas the Galilean did. So I think this could be a second reason that's playing through Luke's mind when he's talking about this.
So my only pushback is this is Antiquities 18, 4-2, right? 4-2. My only pushback is to say this that I'm showing on the screen right now is all in one block. And it explains why Acts gets Theudas first, then Judas the Galilean second, and it's the identical Greek word, same Greek name, Theudas, that we find in Acts. So I guess you could say that yours is a backup model to explain, but I would put this as the chief primary evidence to support what I'm trying to suggest, because you can literally read within 5 sentences and explain the chronological mistake that Acts makes in the exact same place. And this is in Antiquities 20, book 20, chapter 5. So that's my only point, is that I think this is a very strong chronological mistake that you can see why he made it all in 5 sentences and not have to go back 2 books in order to explain why he would have thought back here. And you can read it in the context where it literally says, like, he mentions it as though it sounds like Judas is after Theudas and that Theudas comes before him. But if you're careful reading it, you'll notice he's kind of doing a flashback to that guy who showed up around 6 CE under Quirinius and the tax revolt and all that. So to me, that's a stronger piece of evidence, and you can make a really good case for it there. But I don't rule out the possibility. The only other issue I'd say is the name is identical in that passage I'm showing, whereas you have a name that is a little different spelling in 18.
No, I don't disagree. That's why I said I was trying to imply it was secondary evidence.
Yeah, it's like a backup. There's a plausible, you can plausibly explain that.
Now, here's the other thing. There's a couple of scholars, both of them are Christians. Well, Oscar Coleman, he argued that in First Clement, and then the other one I'm talking about is David Eastman. And David Eastman is still present. Oscar Coleman, He lived in the previous century. But Oscar Coleman argued that Clement is insinuating that other believers had Paul killed, not Romans.
Mm.
And David Eastman agreed. He agrees with Oscar Coleman.
Well,
I cite both of them in my upcoming paper for Bob's Journal.
if I may, just to ask you something to clarify here, because
yes,
when I read Acts, he's going to Jerusalem, right? In Acts.
Yeah, you know where I'm going with this.
He's going to Christians.
Yeah,
right?
So here's what I think. I don't think Luke just had Josephus in front of him, both wars and antiquities. I think he had Clement, first Clement, in front of him. And so Luke is working with all of those texts, but he's got a problem. He doesn't have the Acts of Paul and Thecla. The Acts of Paul, that hasn't been fabricated yet by Lucius Quirinius. We're still many decades away from that text being composed. So he doesn't know about the idea, the story, the fictive story of Emperor Nero ordering Paul's death. Instead, the only martyrdom story he's got to work with is from First Clement, which he doesn't like. Like, no, I'd rather him get killed by Romans, like, James, the son of Zebedee, got killed by Herod Agrippa, who is basically a puppet of the Roman state. So I want martyrdoms like that. I don't want, other believers to kill Paul. We can't have that. That's a bad idea. In the same way that I don't think Acts wants to talk about the attack on James. We've talked about this many times before, because Paul was involved in that attack. And instead, what we get is a story about Stephen and his stoning. But anyway, the point that I'm making is this text was a thorn in Luke's side. And again, here's the other thing I wanted to bring up. Luke brings up in the beginning of his gospel, he uses the Greek word poloi. That he has many poloi sources. That is a problem for those arguing that Luke is before Josephus, because Luke knows many sources, as he admitted. And those many sources can not just include Mark and Matthew and First Clement, but also Josephus and Paul's letters. And so Luke having many sources, him admitting this, makes sense because he knew Josephus. He's kind of giving it away there when he says that. Luke, the man who's using many sources, by his own admission, written admission, being somehow the source for Josephus is ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense at all. Now, you know how I am with hypothetical documents. I love the way you put it earlier, because it's true. Often people will, both scholars, laymen, whoever they may be, there's a tendency to invent hypothetical documents to avoid the elephant in the room. In the same way, I reject this common source for Luke and Josephus in the same way I reject Q, M, L, Proto-Luke, Proto-Mark, Proto-Matthew, Proto-John, and the zillion other hypothetical documents, because we don't have proof that those documents exist. Now, we have lost text, I'm not denying that, but the point that I'm making is we cannot know what is in these lost documents. It cannot be justification for us to create and invent hypothetical documents, because we know we've lost so much from the ancient world. We have to work with what we have to work with. I'm going to paraphrase the late Jacob Neusner.
Come back to this right here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The late Jacob Neusner, he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something to the effect of, we don't know what we don't have. He said something like that. And I agree. And so the simpler argument is that Luke knew Josephus. In the same way, Luke knew Matthew, or you can take the other view that Matthew knew Luke. I go with Luke knew Matthew at present. So that's my point. It's a simpler argument because we're using what we have, and we're not inventing documents that we cannot substantiate.
Yeah, I would just say this, okay? I'm not a philologist, all right? I don't pretend to know whether or not Q for sure existed or didn't exist. But if we're comparing both the Josephus and Luke Acts borrowing from Josephus versus all of the countless philologists who've attempted to reconstruct a Q, or even say there was a Q without reconstructing it, who think there probably was some prior source, that actually has weight in the academic world, even if people disagree with it and say, hey, no, I prefer a Farrer hypothesis, Occam's razor, whatever. That actually at least has some precedence within academia. When you look into this whole Josephus, Luke Acts stuff, I spoke to many hours hanging out with Steve Mason on the phone, going for long walks and stuff. And he pointed out, he says, there's never been two things. So scholarship has never taken serious the idea that Josephus borrowed from Luke Acts. It's never been posited. It's never been proposed. It's never been taken serious. No real scholar ever thinks that's even likely based on the criteria. You just look at the data. No one thinks the reversal would happen. The consensus was common source, but that's a get out of jail free card. And why? Listen, this is what's wild, Jacob. You would agree with me on this. The consensus is common source, a source they've never attempted to reconstruct. No one has even tried to do it. Whereas there has been attempts to try and reconstruct some hypothetical Q source from philologists and whatnot. So I don't think it's the identical, like you can disagree with Q, but you can at least go, there are real scholars doing the best they can, trying to see source material in both Luke and Matthew and thinking there might be something earlier. You can reject it. You can say, I'm not convinced. If there was one, we don't know for sure what it looked like. All of that makes sense. But it at least is a serious scholarly category versus no one has tried reconstructing a common source with Josephus and Luke Acts. And the reason why, and Steve Mason has made the point, is because it looks like Josephus. So why not just take Josephus? And what I did in my presentation was show you over and over that Josephus doesn't even do what Josephus did. So when you read Wars, which was written 15 years prior to Antiquities, Josephus doesn't even follow his own path of how to describe the same events. Why would Luke just so happen to hug Josephus's same wording, same grammar, same context? I mean, if Josephus isn't even doing that with his own writing, it's silly. So I agree with you. I would just say I take more seriously scholars who do consider Q than I do anyone trying to just posit a common source between Luke Acts, because no one's ever attempted to even make that make sense.
I kind of get what you're saying, and I'm not saying that I don't take the reconstruction seriously, but again, that what you just said there, that it looks like Josephus. Well, that same logic can be applied to the Matthew-Luke situation.
Right.
Matthew's double tradition looks like Luke's double tradition, and vice versa.
Right.
And so again, so yes, even though there has not been an attempt to reconstruct Josephus, that's a so-called common source of Luke, and I think the reason there is pretty obvious, because you can't compare Luke Acts to Josephus like you can Matthew of Luke. The data isn't equatable, in which Matthew and Luke has the entirety of the other's double tradition. Luke Acts does not have the entirety of Josephus's material,
right,
with alternating primitivity.
Exactly.
So it is a different ball game, granted.
Yeah. I think it's such a strong case. I honestly think that the shortcoming of this argument is that most of these scholars have not read the argument and actually sat with it and thought through it. And I've had conversations with Daniel B. Glover, Steve Mason, endless scholars who are persuaded by it. And they all say the same thing. Even Goodacre, when I interviewed him the other day, weeks ago. You remember when I did my interview with him?
I think I do, yes.
We talked about this, and he said, we sat in the room, we were at the college, and me and another professor and students, and said, okay, we're not leaving this room till we've read and understood what he's trying to argue. He said after 3.5 hours of looking into it, reading it, studying it, talking it over, and reasoning with it, him and the other professor and many of the students, I don't know if he took a poll of all the students or not, walked out of that room and said, Steve Mason's right. It's so convincing. So I just think it's just not known enough. And I did a Twitter post recently that said, people just don't read their Josephus. I'm like, we've been reading, Christians got really upset. And they were like, we've been reading Josephus for, forever now, And I'm like, that's not my point. Like the scholarship, as Steve Mason points out, even the PhDs on Josephus in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, they read Josephus like, all right, Jacob, we're opening our encyclopedia today and we're going to pull out facts. Just someone who wrote this book just wrote down factual material. We're just going to, oh, yep, that's a fact that Josephus wrote up. Fact. No, Josephus wrote a narrative, a historical narrative. And once they found a way to make a concordance, they had to meticulously break down Josephus's language the same way we have biblical concordances. Once they broke down the concordance, then you could see what was exclusively Josephine language and style. Then Steve Mason said it all became so obvious. So I think we got a few decades before scholars really start wrapping their heads around this.
We got a couple of super chats. Victor, thank you for your super chat. Josephus Antiquities 20 has James passage. Luke would be interested.
The only, and I thought through this because in my debate, this was brought up when I brought up that Luke Acts narrates deaths by only Jewish elites. He never mentions deaths by Romans. Romans aren't killing Christians. It's only Jewish, people of power in the Jewish communities. So why wouldn't he then stick to that protocol, Derek, that you just laid out, and then narrate a death of James, who, according to Josephus, is killed by the priestly group that find him guilty of blasphemy or something, lawlessness, or some kind of breaking of the law, whatever, and they end up killing him. So why wouldn't he, if he knew that event, narrate it? Again, once you get about to the latter half of Acts, we also have Peter. Peter's killed. We would think then, wouldn't he be interested in knowing about Peter's death? Doesn't mention Peter's death. Doesn't mention James' death. Why? The latter half of Acts is concerned with Paul and getting to Rome. He's not shifting. Like if the narrator occasionally broke from Paul and said, hey, and back over here, Peter was doing this. And also over here, James was doing this. Cool. The sole lens is focused on Paul and Paul alone. So I think he knows about all their deaths, or at least has heard traditions about all of them. In his literary work, he has no interest in narrating them. He wants you to know the gospel has made it to Rome unhindered. And likely this is a proto-Catholicizing text. So the church in Rome is rooted, it's grounded, it's divinely sanctioned. You even have people like Gamaliel saying, if it survives, brothers, don't be theomachoi. Like he passes, by the way, all the 7 trials. He's like 5 to 7 trials. Paul gets tried by every person and found innocent. There's all sorts of things. So I just think that he probably was personally interested in these topics, but not for his narration.
The other thing that I think is going on, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this because it's very complicated and we've covered this before, and we will again when the paper is finished. But I think that Luke actually, I think that Luke didn't think that the James and Josephus, despite what Josephus wrote, I don't think he thought that was actually James.
Oh, really?
I think that's another reason why he didn't talk about it. But that's a long story about why I think that.
Interesting.
There's another super chat. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Class 3. What happens when neutron stars collide? Are there new elements created that weren't there before? Have we actually seen an active creation about this? Somebody needs to make a video.
Yeah, so I wrote yesterday, I did a video. I don't know if you're watching my channel Constellation. I did a video with Aaron Adair talking about his Moses material, but I asked him about the stars thing. I actually brought you up and brought this up and said, hey, would you be interested in talking about some of the recent discoveries about the age of our universe and what we're seeing in the cosmic background radiation of the universe and all that kind of stuff? And he said he's not a cosmologist, but he can read up on the paper and talk to some who know the cutting edge stuff and then be able to come on and present it. So I don't know any of this. I'm not a scientist, but he is, and he does plan on joining me for an episode to discuss that. Thank you for the super chat.
There's another thing that I want to pull up. So you see this? So I've talked about this before, and you have a character called Solos, mentioned by Josephus. It's spelled Saul in the translation, but it's Solos. And he and his brother Costoboros are fleeing Jerusalem when the outbreak of the war starts. You notice how there's a mention of the besieging in the first paragraph in the king's palace. So they're fleeing. They get out of there. And what happens is they both appear before Emperor Nero. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on the Nero thing because that's more to do with the fictive martyrdom of Paul, that I think the Acts of Paul essentially plagiarized from Josephus from this passage, but that's another story.
Right.
I think Acts creates the narrative. Notice in the very next paragraph, it talks about chaos in Damascus. Then you go back to the first paragraph and look at the very first sentence. Josephus uses the metaphor, a ship when it was going to sink, as from a ship when it was going to sink, which I find very interesting. And so when you put all that together, I think this narrative.
We got a super chat, by the way, real quick.
Yeah.
Let's come back to Acts here. Steve, thank you so much for that super chat. James Gunn's Superman takes elements from many movies and comics to make his own version. Basically, Luke using Josephus, Matthew Clement, etc. Retcons.
I agree.
Thank you for the super chat. Appreciate that,
Yeah,
Steve. Yeah, really do appreciate that. All right. Did you want to go back to this?
We have one more super chat. Gatus Ambrovics, if I pronounce that correctly. Thank you for your super chat. Justice of Tiberius. Justice of Tiberius replaced due to lack of Jesus. Well, I think that was one of the main reasons. It could have been the main reason, actually, why his work wasn't preserved. I think it was Theudas of Constantinople that told us that Justice of Tiberius never mentioned Jesus, if I remember correctly. Yeah. See, that's another issue I have with the interpolation theorist. Christian copyists, some people believe that the entire testimonium in Josephus was totally inserted. So my question is, why did they do that with Justice of Tiberius? No, instead they don't really care as much about his work. It gets ignored, gets lost, and they just talk about, oh, he didn't mention Jesus. Forget about him. So I think that's an issue there, but I don't think the interpolation theorists have worked out properly, but that's just me.
Thank you, Gaddis. Appreciate that.
Okay, so we're back to Acts. So I think this whole thing that we see right here in Acts 9:19 to 25, you'll notice here, it's rewriting the narrative of 2 Corinthians. In my upcoming paper, I argue that that's because 2 Corinthians makes a historical error in which it claims that King Aretas IV controlled Damascus when he never did. The author of Acts compensated for this mistake by claiming, no, he didn't flee from King Aretas now. He actually fled from Jews. He fled from Jews. He fled from Damascus. So he still flees from Damascus, being lowered from a basket, just like in 2 Corinthians. But instead, he's fleeing from Jews who supposedly want to kill him.
Let me ask you this, because this, you know how you talked about earlier, you had a backup explanation for Theudas. This would fit kind of like you did earlier. This would fit Acts' agenda of shifting the blame on the Jewish elites, on trying to cause and persecute the Christian movement. So it would just complement what you're saying, that Acts is correcting an already historical blunder made in the letters of Paul, and yet still lines it up to where it actually was Jewish, Jewish elites that are trying to get him instead.
Yeah, because if you read Josephus, just like in that passage I showed earlier, and there's another passage in which this is also further explained, Solos was in conflict with Jews. He was fleeing from the palace, like I talked about earlier. Josephus even referred to Solos as a wicked man, and he was stirring up trouble. So Acts is basically reconstructing the epistolary Paul via a literary conflation with Solos in Josephus. So Solos and Paul are basically being blended together into the same person. And I think this also plays a role in the fictive transformation of Saul into becoming Paul and Acts. Because I also think Luke had Solus in mind and Josephus. Therefore, the chronology of Paul in the letters, which is a bit ambiguous in a lot of ways, is reconfigured into a 50-60 CE context. Because again, the standard view of Paul being in place in the 50s and 60s is not based on the letters as much. It's ironically based on Acts, the same document that a lot of those same scholars are very skeptical of. Mm-hmm. Yet they take the chronology for granted. Acts is creating this reboot Pauline chronology based on that character Solus who was mentioned by Josephus.
Interesting. Look, you got a super chat here. Dasonic says, oh, sorry. Please elaborate on Paul killed by peers, not Rome. So we'll come back to us for a second here.
Let me pull up 1 Clement then, because that's relevant. Okay. So here's what I think happened. Okay, so I'm going to get in a little bit into my theory. My suspicion is, I think the Paul actual, like the OG Paul the Apostle, so the real guy, was killed probably in the year 39 CE. There's a few reasons why I put his death that early. When you look at what Clement is saying about this guy, about the OG Paul, he ends up in the furthest west of the empire. I have the passage right here. Having taught righteousness unto the whole world and having reached the farthest bounds of the west. Okay, so we're in Hispania. If you look in Romans 15, Romans sets itself up as kind of like a prequel to that situation. Acts does the same thing. Acts is setting itself up as a prequel that's expanding the narrative of Clement. It's saying, oh, here's the background of Paul's conflict with the Jews that are plotting to kill him, but still fails to discuss the martyrdom. So Acts leaves a gap in which Clement already filled. Romans tells you a story about Paul planning to go to Hispania. It doesn't tell you he made it there because Clement already tells you the other part. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So while, for instance, Acts doesn't want to admit that Paul was killed by envious men, he also, in a sense, is trying to justify what he's doing in a literary sense by saying, oh, well, we're just complimenting each other. So I talk about details that Clement doesn't talk about. Clement talks about details I don't talk about. That's how people look at it. They won't see the larger agenda here. So
to support what you just said, too, yeah. I mean, I know that it might be difficult for a lot of people to wrap their minds around the whole issue, but the fact that you and I both know that Acts is papering over real beefs and making an act there isn't any is enough for us to have the red flags up in our minds and saying, hey, something's going on here, and maybe there is more to this. I mean, take the basic stuff that we've heard a million times from Bart Ehrman, where, Peter is the Gentile. He goes to the Gentiles first, but that's Paul's mission. And like how they make them sing Kumbaya in Acts, whereas in the letters of Paul, they're not. It's very problematic tensions that are going on between the super apostles, the Jerusalem church, and Paul. And I think that what Jacob's pointing out is you have to have suspicion of the narration and why he wouldn't have narrated these things. It may tie into this tradition you're talking about. That's what you're trying to say.
Yeah, and here's the other thing that I think really gives it away, because I think it's in Acts 15.
You looking it up?
Well, I'm going to say this more cautiously because I can't find exactly what I'm looking for. But
okay, I'm putting me on the screen.
So I'm going to say, I think that Acts may have mentioned a letter of James or something connected to that, something to that effect, somewhere in Acts, and it kind of gives itself away. I think it kind of gave itself away there. That is if I remember. That is if I'm remembering correctly. That by saying this, if you know a letter that's direct conflict with Galatians, because the Epistle of James is countering a lot of the points you see in Romans and Galatians. Well, how do you know that while pretending not to talk about Paul's letters? That's kind of strange.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you do know the letters, but you're not talking about them because you're kind of rebooting Paul's letters, and you know you're contradicting them so much that using them would be detrimental.
You stole the words out of Daniel B. Glover's mouth. I mean, that's his point. He in his critique of the early date, he says, notice that this traveling companion, I put in scare quotes that, a lot of apologists like to make, doesn't mention Paul writing letters at all. He doesn't like to mention Paul as a letter writer. And he knows a lot of things, yet contradicts those actual letters we read. So I think it was M. David Litwa who, in an interview with Daniel Glover, said he thinks, and this is what you're practically saying, that this author does not want you to have your first nibbling of Paul through any other source but his. He wants you to be introduced to Paul through his perception of Paul. The painted picture that he paints in Luke Acts is what he wants you to see Paul through. He doesn't want you to see Paul through those letters. He wants you to see Paul through the lens that he's painting. That's the whole goal of Luke Acts in terms of the Pauline material. And because if you read it through the letters, it doesn't look good. So somehow he wants to give you a different impression.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
What do you look for?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find that mention. I'm pretty sure it's in Acts 15, but
got another super chat while you're looking there. Steve M.
Sure.
1984. Thank you again for the super chat, my friend. Is Acts really just Luke's Aeneid? I think so. I think it is clearly giving you a early church epic, so to speak, historical fiction of the church's origins, the same way the epic or the Aeneid for Virgil is supposed to be a historical mythic origin of Rome and the emperor, of course, specifically Augustus. So I do think that's what's going on to some degree. It is no doubt Luke Acts is definitely doing a ton of imitation, and McDonald's book, I got it back here somewhere. Hold on. We got Luke and the Politics of Homeric imitation. Luke Acts as rival to the Aeneid. So if you don't have this book, it's beautiful hardback copy. Absolutely must get it. Definitely need to check this out. There's all sorts of stuff going on with the rivalry between the Aeneid and Luke. And if you don't know, I've done a few interviews. You've interviewed with Michael Koshinosh, right?
Michael Koshinosh?
Yeah, I would say
I'm actually going to interview him for the first time soon.
Good.
Actually.
Good. That guy's brilliant. And he was a
Absolutely,
student, of course, who imitates that. I'm thinking there's more back here of the Luke Acts stuff.
I think I found what I'm looking for.
Okay.
It is in Acts 15. I wanted to look at it for a bit to be more sure that this is what I thought. That this is what I had in mind. But yeah, I'll go ahead and read it
Yeah. Thank you, Steve, for the super chat.
Yeah, thank you. When they finished, James spoke up. Brothers, he said, listen to me. Simon has described to us how God first intervened to choose a people for his name from the Gentiles. The words of the prophets are in agreement with this, as it is written. After this, I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent. Its ruins I will rebuild. I will restore it, that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name. Says the Lord who does these things known from long ago. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood.
Mm-hmm.
So you have James being maybe in a slight vague way, but not super vague, being associated with letter writing activity from the way that these words are being put into his mouth.
Like right to them. Yeah, that's interesting. That's
and so I think Luke is kind of giving a wink wink that he knows the epistle of James. Like, well, okay, if you know the epistle of James, then how can you possibly expect us to believe you don't know the 13 canonical Pauline letters? Dude, that doesn't make any sense.
I think Pervo did in his work, he wrote, I've got the Mystery of Acts back here too. I don't know if the Mystery of Acts is where he covers it. Is somewhere over here. In it, he covers, I think it might be Dating Acts, but he covers in depth parallels to show that Luke Acts knows Paul's letters. It's pretty scandalous. Like once you recognize how much he's using of the letters in common, they have the common material. And guess what the standard typical go-to position is on this? It's not literary dependence on the letters, and that Luke Acts decides to rework his letters. No. They want to try and go, no. The guy traveled to the areas and got this information through the local churches in order to gain and ascertain these ideas. I'm like, what? Like, again, you're positing, it doesn't sound like Occam's razor to me. That they just don't like looking at these authors as literary artists that have their own willingness to create and craft their own narratives. And I find that sad that we have to posit all of these hypothetical situations to make sense of why the overlap with the letters of Paul exists. Oh, and he documents like 70, I might be underselling this or overselling it by a few, but it's like 75, 76 examples in Luke Acts that mirror the letters of Paul, but Acts does not mention Paul ever writing letters. He doesn't mention Paul ever going to Jerusalem and paying them this money that he talks about over and over in his letters. There's so many things that he contradicts, and that's a big one, by the way. The whole paying Jerusalem money for the poor in Jerusalem. Paul makes such a big deal out of this in his actual letters that it would be ridiculous for someone not to narrate that in this Acts 15 scene where he appears to Jerusalem and comes to the rest of the apostles. That would have been narrated had he had a concern with real historical, what was really going on according to the letters, in my opinion. And not just mine, but many scholars highlight this problem.
Right.
What you looking for now?
Oh, no, I just want to say real quick, James Valiant, thank you for bringing up Acts 15:23 in the chat earlier. I was already looking in the area, but that still helped.
James in the house. What's up, James?
So yeah, you have Acts like we were covering earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Acts has this remaking of the Damascus flight based on a very similar flight of Solus from the king's palace, from Herodium. So again, it's the same situation. And Robert Eisman, he talks about this, that there's a contradiction. I don't think he's the only one that's talked about this by far, because it's very obvious that there's like a 30-year contradiction between 2 Corinthians and Acts. Are we to believe that Paul escaped from Damascus 2 times and was lowered from a basket 2 times, 30 years apart? Really? No, that didn't happen. I don't think either event happened. 2 Corinthians is believed, because we have to, the way the standard view looks at it is it's Pauline. He couldn't possibly make a mistake. How could he get this wrong? Well, the thing is, if one were to admit that it's an error, because it is, there's really no way of getting around it. The standard scholars are all over the map about how to fix this problem. They have no idea how to solve this problem, because they just don't want to admit that it is wrong. But if you admit that 2 Corinthians is just flat wrong about this, then, well, we got a little problem, because you're going to start heading into forgery territory. Oh, we can't have that. This is a holy letter from Paul. We cannot say this is a forgery. That's just going too far. We can't apply what we do to the Gospels to this. No, we got to believe that Paul is right because he's Paul. And that's how it looks to me. It's like, oh, come on, Jacob. This is ridiculous. Don't pester us about this. I'm like, well, then explain to me why it looks that way, but yet it's not. Why are we giving Paul an excuse here? Why are we giving these letters excuses?
I think, and I'm just throwing one piece of spaghetti at the wall, I think that the common trap is look at the genre change, right? They go, look at the genre. These are letters. And they think that somehow brings up the credibility of like, these are more mundane. They're not legendary, crafted stories you find in the Gospels. And yet, I think people like Nina Livesey, who study the genre and recognize no letter writing at that time, if you were doing a heuristic approach and comparing it to other letter writings, they weren't this verbose, this long. You're not going to find letters that are written this way and so well written out, so long and stuff. She goes through all of this in her book. I've got it right here. But I figure it's worth showing it for people because I think your point is important, because even if you don't agree with her thesis, if you see that letters don't change these are so much more reliable, like you can have fake letters. This should be self-explanatory though, Jacob, because scholars already accept Ephesians as pseudo Paul and all of these other books. But when you find these problems, you would think some of them would wrestle with it and go, Jacob, you kind of have a point. Maybe Paul didn't really write this one. Maybe the other one.
I remember Frank Hughes telling me, he wrote a wonderful book on the Corinthian correspondence with the late Bob Jewett about, he thinks that he and the late Bob think that 1st and 2nd Corinthians together were originally 8 letters that have been compressed down to 2. Mm-hmm. But we do have a super chat.
Yes.
Which is still on the Corinthian topic too, so that works out. Back in, thank you for your super chat.
Thank you.
2 Corinthians is not saying that the Herodians controls the area. He is pursuing Saul because he is a Herodian into Arabia. Read is controlled Nabateans. Okay, so let me make a correction to the first half of this sentence. I never said Herodians control the area. I was saying that 2 Corinthians is saying that King Aretas controlled Damascus. That it does say. There's no getting around that. It clearly makes this claim, and it's wrong. Now, again, I think, understand my position. I believe the letters were plagiarizing Josephus, just like Acts. That's a very radical view. I've been arguing it for many years. I believe the letters was plagiarizing Josephus. So Romans and 2 Corinthians may give you an impression that Paul is a Herodian. Because guess who really was a Herodian? That very man I showed all of you earlier, Saulus. Josephus specifies that man, Saulus, and his brother Christoborus were kinsmen to Herod Agrippa II.
Real quick, Bakken came up with another super chat, said, Swaparitas controlling area, Herodians did.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe they mistaken. Are they correcting themselves, Bacchus?
I guess so. Thank you for that additional super chat. But anyway, my point stands, and that is, I think that Romans 16 suggesting that Paul was a Herodian was due to the conflation with the guy in Josephus. Now, I know that Saul is not mentioned in the letters, but the name Saul is implied in the letters in Philippians. That's why you have this whole deal about the tribe of Benjamin. King Saul was a Benjamite. And you do have Paul persecuting Jesus, who's portrayed as a descendant of King David in the letters. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the point that Jesus is a descendant of David is stressed in Romans. Now, I know it's not only just stressed in Romans. It's discussed elsewhere, like in 2 Timothy. Mm-hmm. But Romans talks about this. And it's also the same letter that identifies Paul as a Herodian. So again, Clement knows nothing about Paul being a Herodian, because that idea hasn't been invented yet or fabricated yet. Romans fabricates this based on conflating that man in Josephus with Paul. The same way Acts will do the same thing later, decades later, but for a different reason and in a different in a different way.
Okay, thank you so much. We got another one here. Desonics sent a super chat. What are the implications of a Paul forgery?
Well, if you mean if what I think you mean by that question is is correct, that the implications of the whole thing being a total forgery, it means we can know very little about the historical Paul beyond what Clement says. And maybe, well, I would also say include the details in the pseudo-Clementine recognitions, which doesn't give us that much more information about Saul, because he's like briefly mentioned in that massive voluminous text, and that is it. So beyond that, we would know very, very little about Paul. And I do think that Paul was a letter writer, since Clement does tell us that he wrote a letter that has material that shows up in 1 Corinthians, but he doesn't quote much of it. In fact, he doesn't really quote it. It's more to do with he describes part of it, and that's it. So I do think Paul wrote something that was significantly expanded upon in the canonical text, but we can only get a glimpse of it from First Clement, and that's it. And that's the other thing that's my gripe with the idea that First Clement is a later forgery. So this is a point where I disagree with Nina Livesey and others, that and also Bob Price, that I don't think First Clement is a later creation. I think it is genuine. I think it was written in the 90 CE, because it is so ignorant. It is unmistakably ignorant of the New Testament. It does not know that Paul wrote a 13-letter collection. You can check the Greek. He does not know about Paul being killed by Romans. He does not know about the Gospels. It is such an empty text. I have a hard time conceptualizing somebody forging. At this point, it wouldn't just be a forgery. If the whole thing was created from whole cloth, that's not just a forgery, it's worse. It's a fabrication. So if it was fabricated, meaning none of it goes back to the original Clement, then why would somebody do this? Why would somebody create a letter post New Testament? Because that's what I would have to believe, if this is a fabrication and Clement did not write it, while surgically, with extreme precision, choose elements that are very primitive, create a story that would conflict with the beliefs of other Christians, that, oh, he was killed by envious men, and then not talk about Paul's vision. Yeah, that's the problem, because First Clement doesn't know anything about Paul's vision. He just totally ignores that, really. So Clement is so shockingly ignorant that's why I have such a problem with putting that later. Now, some that do want everything regarding Paul to be fake, fabricated, out of thin air. Yeah, I would even call the certain position called, I would refer to as Marcion supremacy. What do I mean by Marcion supremacy? It's the idea that literally everything and absolutely everything began with Marcion, which that position is so extreme. I don't even think other Marcion priority scholars would even agree with that. But there's a few people out there that hold that position, that everything before Marcion is fake. Okay, so if we're going to go with Marcion as the Big Bang of all of Christianity, literally, they do have an agenda to put First Clement later, big time. Because, like, okay, First Clement would be a big conflict with the idea that Marcion's the Big Bang. And so they do have a reason to put First Clement after Marcion, which some do. But again, for the same reasons I have mentioned before, I disagree with this.
Just to add my comments on the question, as much as I understand it in one sentence here, the implications for having a Paul forgery would be like having a very important cultic figure in whatever movement you imagine. They're no longer around, but you found a letter that was written by them, and it was their teaching or something they believed or held to that they believed was true. There's power in crafting stories that can shift and change and give you authority in wherever you currently are within the movement. So if you're someone, let's say later in the 1st century, early 2nd century, and you want something to support what you believe, and you have the head honcho back here, you claim wrote this letter, you can actually gain power and more authority by having Paul, which is really you, whoever the person is, saying something to support what you want. So yeah, you could use it for several different reasons, but mostly a power grab and competition with other Christians, I think, played a huge role early on with Paul and the various other apostolic claims. Thank you to Sonic for the super chat. We got Gristly Knuckle in the house with a super sticker. Thank you so much for that super sticker. Really appreciate that, Gristly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bakken is back again. Thank you, Bakken. Hiding the Herodian element is what Acts does. It puts Aretas as king on purpose to excuse his explosion as a separate matter from heritage of Saul.
Oh, I got a lot to say about this. So thank you for your super chat, first of all. Second of all, Acts does not talk about King Aretas. We get this from 2 Corinthians. Now, you say that Acts is hiding that Paul's a Herodian. Well, if we believe that Paul was historically a Herodian, that's what we'd have to think. As I've admitted before, and I'll say it again, I used to think like this. Why do I not think like this now? Well, here's the problem. You have to conflate your perception of Paul, because again, the idea that he is, then is just different variants of the theory. Okay, I'll grant that, and there are times I did not believe that the Saulos mentioned by Josephus was Paul, and today I do not think that character is Paul. Just to be clear, now Saulos is a Herodian. I said this earlier. Okay, but Josephus makes that very clear. It's not up for debate. But Robert Eisenman claims that person is Paul. Do you see the issue here? You have to then read the biblical Paul into that character in Josephus. And Josephus never tells you that Saulos was a follower of Jesus. Never says that he's a Christian. Never says any of these things. So on top of Acts hiding that Paul was a Herodian, I have to believe that Josephus is hiding that Saulos the Herodian was Paul. Do you see my issue here? That door is swinging in both ways, and it's not good. It's circular reasoning. You follow me, Derek? So so to me, the text conflating the two makes more sense, other than them literally being entirely the same human being, completely through and through, because then you have a problem trying to explain Acts is hiding it in one way and Josephus is hiding it in the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I got a problem.
You're saying one's drawing from the other as its source for crafting the story, and
yes.
it's a simple one-way direction instead of both trying to make sense of it.
Because that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Bakken. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
And then Gristly also followed up and said, "You're welcome." Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate that. Yeah, we really, really appreciate that. Yeah, I don't know where we left off as far as we were going into this material. I think I've laid out. I mean, there's material I could get into. I brought some stuff that we could get into showing. Let me show my screen. Can I share my screen? Before presenting a screen, remove other media from. Oh, okay. Let me do this. All right. So I've got, the Theudas material we could get into. I just brought this. This is a much more polished up kind of version showing timelines, going through Acts versus Josephus, specifically on the history here with Theudas, Judas the Galilean, and Theudas, where Josephus puts them, gets into all of this stuff. Why Theudas mattered to Josephus, which would be an insignificant character. There were many other claimants and prophets and people that Acts likes to call magicians and whatnot. There were many other ones that don't get named by Josephus, but you would imagine an independent historian would name them, and all sorts of stuff. So I get into all these materials there. I've got a Quirinius issue, which I really went over all this stuff for the dating. What I find interesting is how the entire region was annexed. Let me pull up a map here real quick, actually.
Okay.
Just to show people kind of. Did I bring the map? I didn't put the map in there. Dang it. Okay. Well, the whole region was annexed in like 66 BCE under Mark Antony. And once you get that annexation of the territory by Mark Antony, and then later you start to find out that Quirinius ends up taking over because Herod had 3 sons. So here's this little you could say genealogy. Herod the Great, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip. Herod Antipas and Philip kicked ass. They did good. But Archelaus sucked, and he gets banished, right? He's a dud. He didn't do good. So he sends Quirinius, who's like his like very important high noble guy in the Roman Empire, to take over the territory, of course, when Archelaus fell apart. And he taxes the region around 4 CE. And that's when you get Judas the Galilean and all this stuff starts to come up. There's so much material that overlaps. You would expect another historian who's documenting these events, especially if they supposedly lived in them around this time, to give you different material. I'm not talking about mentioning one guy that's different. You find a guy who ruled in Rome that gets mentioned specifically in passing that you don't find mentioned in Josephus. I'm talking about covering the same historical events, because what Josephus does with his own material, even when you like compare them here, War 2 and Josephus 18, he doesn't even share the same identical material. Like he talks about Coponius in War 2, Judas the Galilean, he mentions him, but then he doesn't mention Quirinius, doesn't mention the apography, no revolt against the registration, no Joazar the high priest, no Zadok, no explanation for why Judea was reabsorbed into Syria. But then he explains all of it in Antiquities. He doesn't cover that material. So like you would think Luke, this guy who's a separate historian writing about events that he supposedly has factual knowledge on, in every case, whether, Lysanias, whether it be the Pharisees, the perception would be uniquely different, and there would be elements and details that are not dependent upon Josephus. That was my whole point in coming into making the late date for Luke Acts, and why the reversal doesn't work. We covered all this stuff early on. I pretty much said everything I needed to say about this. If there's anything, any super chats we missed, or anything you felt we must get off our chest, so help us God.
I said all I had to say. We don't have any more super chats that I can see right now.
Okay. Well, we could just briefly, I just made some beautiful, beautiful charts here. I'd love to get these in the hands of people. I don't know how to make an HTML where everybody can get their hands on it, so they can actually go look at all this stuff themselves. The Galilean and the Tetrarch, getting into more of the Judas the Galilean. Specifically, here's the other red flag, right? Judas the Galilean. We all know that. Guess what? He isn't technically a Galilean. He's from Golan. He's from Gamala. He's from Golan Heights, okay? So he would be Judas the Golanite. And this is what Josephus does describe in his writings. He talks about him as a Golanite. You would think an independent historian wouldn't use the same Galilean title for the guy who's specifically a Golanite, which Josephus calls him a Golanite, but then also uses the title Galilean. Why does Luke Acts use the Galilean? Look at Antiquities, look closely. There's so much material here that people, I think, when they dig into it, they're stuck. You really have to go, oh my gosh. And that's why a lot of apologists, I think, who've ran into this go, oh, there's 2 Theudases. Oh, well, there must have been another this guy. Every time you turn around.
Didn't he, in the debate, didn't your opponent say that the Egyptian in Acts was a different guy than the one in Josephus because of it's a different number of men that he led?
No, he's ultimately arguing that they were independently coming to the same historical information, and that's why their numbers are different. But he prefers Luke Acts as the historian over Josephus, and I find that ironic, because like the imperial records that this guy would have had access to, the historical massive information he would have had his hands on to craft the massive 20 volumes? 20 volumes work. I mean, And then you get like a sentence, literally in Luke Acts, a sentence, but then you get masses of paragraphs of elaborated, couched in this figure served for 4 years and then died, and then this person arose and there was a problem over here. Like, it's so historically wedded into the context. And then Luke just mentions a sentence. He goes, oh, nope, I trust him as the historian over the other guy. Look, I'm not saying trust blindly Josephus at all. I'm saying, though, that when you read the histories over against Luke Acts, it's pretty obvious to me when you have a census for the whole world and you could just go read. No, Quirinius was governor over Syria. Guess what got absorbed into Syria? Josephus tells us. When the one dud of a son of Herod fails to do what he's supposed to when he's ruling the area, guess what? Augustus says no more. They banish him to like the western part of the empire where he's no longer allowed in the territory. And Quirinius comes down and runs this taxation on the region, not the known world. And you see this language, like you can see why Luke likes to use like all-encompassing type of language, whereas very specific and very accurate and precise about these details that we find in Josephus. And the guy I was arguing against was saying, when you're talking about history, he used an argument from like 1940 to 1945. There are 3 major historical figures we can all probably come to independently. And he mentioned Hitler. He mentioned
I remember about Stalin.
Yeah, Stalin, and he mentioned Churchill. Okay. And he said, guess what? Would it'd be parallelomania to suppose that 2 different historians wouldn't come up with these 3 guys. But when you have so much information, at some point you'd think, there are actually other historical people at the time that were as popular at the time that you could mention in your histories. Why is it the identical same characters, same features, and even the mistakes they make look so obvious why they made it? You would imagine an independent historian who's doing research. They aren't the only 3 guys on planet Earth. And yeah, they might be mentioned, but you would imagine more elaboration on other figures. You don't get that. That's a red flag. So he was trying to make an independent thing, but then the other move he tried to make, which was really odd, because when you go read every single commentary on the planet, the mention of the Egyptian, you got this Roman who has him in he's arrested, and he's saying, hey, can I talk to you? And he speaks to him in Greek. Paul says, hey, in fact, let me pull it up. I've got it right here. The Tribune. Here we go. Let's show you this, because this is a red flag, man. This is a red flag. The Tribune's impossible questions, Acts 21. Roman Tribune asked Paul whether he is the Egyptian who led 4,000 Sicarii into the desert. That figure never existed, but 3 things that did exist sit one after another on the same page of Josephus. Paul on the Antonia stairs. Here's what he has to say. And let me try to crop it in if I can. I wonder if there's a way to make it bigger so you can actually see those words better. Using my wife's laptop. I'm waiting on my new computer to get in, man. I'm sorry. I can't crop in. Anyway, is it all right if I speak to you, Paul says. The Tribune says, wait, you know Greek? So then you aren't the Egyptian. This guy was trying to say that this guy was saying this Tribune was saying that Paul was the Egyptian. Okay. Go read every expert on the Greek here. Go read any and every expert. And in English, this question can sound like he's saying, so you're not the Egyptian, as if he believes he might be the Egyptian. But he's not. He's saying, oh, so you're not the Egyptian who some time ago caused big ruckus and led 4,000 men into the Sicarii, into the desert, blah, blah, blah. Paul says, I am a Judean fellow from Tarshish in Cilicia. So no,
even in plain English, it's pretty obvious that all the confusion was resolved. Oh, you're not the guy. Moving on.
Exactly. Now, why did Luke decide to pop this in there? This is where Steve Mason points out that like he likes to make you think he knows things. And he does know some things. Don't get me wrong. But he really likes it. He wants to flex. It's like if I was writing sentences and I start to use the word verisimilitude and like higher grammar to impress you that I know what I'm talking about. I'm smart. I know things. Well, he's wanting to color it with all sorts of historical verisimilitude. in order for you to think he knows what he's talking about. But when you look carefully, he butchers these three categories, as I showed earlier. The other is, I don't know if I got into this one, the King Agrippa's death. I didn't cover this. This is another one. So if we've already factored in that he does know Josephus, when you see how he narrates the death of King Agrippa I in the story, I'm just going to come back to me so that way we're not boring people with all these visuals. But Felix and Drusilla, and you go into the various, historical figures that show up here. There's also more material that goes on in my documentary that I did on Steve Mason. So let's come back to you and me. In Josephus, Agrippa I is around some slave, someone who's imprisoned. And the guy goes, "Can I speak to him?" This is Josephus's narration. He comes to him and says, "May I speak to you like honestly and openly about what is going on here? And I have a prophecy, an omen for you." And he's like, "Sure, go ahead, say it like it is." And he says, "Okay, here's the deal. You're going to end up dying the next time you see this Greek term, angelos, this bird that's like an owl. When it shows up and you see this bird again, you're going to die within 5 days." So he's prophesying the death of Agrippa I. Well, you fast forward, I don't know if it's a whole book ahead, but it's definitely chapters, many chapters ahead. And Agrippa decides he's going to wear this really glowing raiment of silver outfit. And he sits with the sun reflecting off of him, and he gleams like a bright light. The people are calling him a god in the context. They're literally praising him and saying, "You're a god. Look at you. You're shining forth like a god." He doesn't say, hey, I'm not a god. Hubris gets the hold of him. So he ends up kind of accepting it in a way like, oh, they're admonishing me. And he allows these people to call him a god. Next thing you know, he sees this angelos, this divine presence in the form of an owl. And 5 days later, he dies. In the book of Acts, guess what we see? We don't get the whole detail. We don't get all the context you get Josephus gets. It imitates, but it also differs in one way. When he sees this angelos, he then dies that same hour by worms. So Luke Acts changes what's going on in Agrippa I's death. And then you can get into Felix and you can get into Drusilla. All of these characters show up in Josephus. And it's significant that these characters are popping up because this author wants you to know, oh, he knows things. But our guy also played a role with these big names that he thinks are important in Josephus. That is ultimately what's going on, as Steve Mason, I think, did a really fantastic job showing. So I've rambled. Anyway, we got a few super chats.
You got a couple.
All right, let's hit them.
Mr. Anderson, thank you for your super chat. Sorry late to this to the stream today, but did you cover any of John's possible references of Luke Acts?
No, did not get into the idea of John possibly being influenced by Luke Acts or vice versa. We did not cover any of that. We didn't think, I mean, it wasn't necessary for my case because I was specifically dealing with Josephus, but that is an interesting thing to get into is like, is John referencing Luke Acts? Some think that Luke Acts would be referencing John. I don't know. There's a few people that do date Luke Acts later than John, but I think most people think John's the last.
Nicole, thank you for your super chat. Nothing much to say. Just wanted to send some support. Thanks for all your great work. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I want more people to take serious Steve Mason. And obviously critical scholarship. Go check it out for yourself. I really think that when you dive in and you absorb it, it becomes more obvious that this is not independent. And it's definitely not, there's no reason to posit a common source. No reason,
Agreed.
Especially when you don't have one. And nobody's reconstructed it. So, and even if they attempted philologically, they would run into something that looks like Josephus. And isn't it ironic that Josephus himself doesn't imitate his earlier works 15 years ago when he's willing to change his own material? That's a huge red flag to me that real historians who are writing history don't write the same things, even when they're writing their own works. Josephus doesn't even sound like Josephus in many of the things he's accounting. Why does Luke have to look so close? to Josephus? Because he's borrowing from Josephus.
Yes.
Jacob, I love you, man. I really appreciate you doing these with me. These are always a blast. And you know, you're a brother, man. When we got to get you down here in the studio sometime and actually get some recordings again, have you come down to Florida, make an excuse to go have some fun and then watch a movie or something. I don't know. We'll do something, hang out and do some recordings that are polished and, people can check out discussions. We never launched the ones we did before because, well, we improved upon them and we were like, no, we don't want to send those out. They're not ready. But I think we do have a few with John Dominic Crossan that we should put out there that we haven't.
Yeah. We'll look into that. Yeah.
Okay. He lives 40 minutes from me, 30, 45 minutes from me. So if you come, we'll schedule a day that works where he can try and pop up too, and we can do it again.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope they like the video, share the video, drop a comment, make some noise. Yeah.
Yep.
Any last words from you, bro?
No, thank you for having me on.
Thank you. All right, let's do it again.
Absolutely.
Peace. Thank you, everybody, for the super chats. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.